Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the Government's Annual Rates Taxation and Remedial Matters Bill. This is a bill that, in a way, is a bit of an overview of the Government's fiscal strategy and taxation strategy. It doesn't cover all aspects of the Government's tax strategy by any means, but it does give a very clear signal about where the Government's going. And of course, part of what the Government's doing at a time when we're facing around the world tremendous pressure on sovereign debt, this is a government that's driving us further into debt by the very, very expensive and significant cuts they've made in income tax rates. This is, of course, the annual rate setting bill, and the cut in income tax that the government has made have cost the country very large amounts of money. The government at the time argued that its changes to income tax rates were fiscally neutral. That wasn't true at the time. According to the budget papers, it was going to cost $1 billion over 4 years. Of course, since then it's cost more than that because the GST take hasn't met the level that they expected. So the government's changes with regard to the taxation system have put the government books in a worse fiscal position than they would have been otherwise. So at a time when there is enormous pressure on governments around the world on government borrowing, why would you make a series of changes to the tax system that result in the government going further into debt? It isn't logical and it isn't rational. At the time, the Green Party warned the government that driving the government books further into the red was not a very wise fiscal strategy, but the government took no notice, of course, and carried on regardless and went ahead with the tax cuts. The result has been that they've been having to borrow billions of dollars from overseas. Now, that seemed to go okay, but every day that passes, the pressure on sovereign debt grows and grows. So developing a strategy around increasing government debt at a time when there is enormous pressure on sovereign debt seems to me an extremely dangerous strategy, and I think the government needs to reconsider its general direction with regard to fiscal and tax policy, which is basically let's borrow lots of money tax policy. The other part, of course, that the government has failed to introduce is a broadening of the tax system. Every report you read about the New Zealand tax system argues for a broadening of the New Zealand tax system. That is, to move on to some other bases rather than relying so heavily on the existing forms of taxation. The most obvious one here is around property and capital gains tax. The government has, for entirely political reasons and ideological reasons, not accepted the advice that's come from pretty much every international organisation as well as numerous New Zealand domestic ones, that we should fill the hole in our tax system around the missing tax around capital gains tax, which is distorting the tax system in New Zealand. This bill, unfortunately, once again fails to address that particular hole in the tax system, the absence of a capital gains tax, and it misses the opportunity, which is clearly available, to actually broaden the tax base in New Zealand. One of the other areas that the OECD has been calling on New Zealand to introduce is around a charge on water, irrigation water. The OECD has said consistently that if we wish to actually broaden the tax base, we need to look at levying charges around resource use. And the most obvious one in New Zealand is around irrigation water. So once again, the OECD has put forward a very strong case for broadening the tax base by having a levy on irrigation water, and once again the government has said no. So one time after another we've seen the government turn their back on opportunities to broaden the tax base, and this bill is yet another opportunity. In the very large number of remedial changes that they make in this bill, at no point do they make an attempt to broaden the tax base, which is what all the international studies have been calling on New Zealand to do, to broaden the tax base. Of course, they are making changes around GST. The increase that the government introduced around GST has a largely regressive nature because it tends to affect those on lower incomes more. And so by putting GST, of course, the effect of putting GST, making sure that GST applies to late payments, which tend to be people who have trouble meeting their payments, whether it's for their electricity bill or for their phone bill, the government's saying, look, we're going to make sure that we get those who are on lower incomes, whatever happens, we're going to make sure they pay more. And the increase in GST was one part of it, and now extending the GST to late payments is the other part of it. The other element, of course, that's missing in the government's tax system is around greenhouse emissions. Now, if you read the literature, and unfortunately I guess the government doesn't, but there is a vast amount of economic literature about making sure that we don't subsidise greenhouse pollution. In fact, Tim Grosser said some very interesting comments recently about not subsidising pollution. He talked about fossil fuel subsidies, in fact, was the reference he made in that speech. He said it was terrible that there are all these subsidies around fossil fuels. Well, here we have a tax bill which continues with the system whereby we subsidise greenhouse gas emissions to the tune this year of about $1.2 billion, another $1.2 billion over the next few years. So we're in a situation where the government has made a conscious decision to subsidise greenhouse gas pollution in New Zealand rather than make polluters pay and pay their way. And the tax system that they're introducing, not only is it narrow and fails to broaden the tax base by making sure that we actually have taxes in other areas, it also continues through the tax system and the ETS the subsidies that are going to pollution. So here we have Minister Grosser saying we shouldn't be subsidising fossil fuel subsidies, he said. And on the other hand, we have a government which is subsidising greenhouse gas pollution. Whereas in fact, if the government actually had removed these subsidies, then it would mean the amount of taxes you'd need to raise through bills like this one and others would actually be significantly reduced. You either could cut the amount of taxes that people are paying through other mechanisms, or you could pay off debt faster. And at a time when the international markets are looking at countries like New Zealand with very high levels, or rather not very high levels, but growing levels of sovereign debt, being able to pay down or reduce debt more quickly is actually a real benefit. So the fact that we have these subsidies in place has added to the pressure on New Zealand in the international markets. The other aspect of this bill, which is kind of a little bit strange, of course, is the one around software development. Now, one could well argue there's a case for the special, basically, tax subsidies for unsuccessful software development. But you've got to then ask, why wouldn't you have an across-the-board R&D taxation support? Rather than picking particular kinds of industry in which to provide tax subsidies, why wouldn't you spread R&D support, if you were to do it through the tax system, across the board and have research and development tax credits rather than targeting your tax credits, in this case, at unsuccessful software developers, which is essentially what they're doing? There is a strong case. Because of the positive externalities around research and development, it's very difficult for any particular firm to actually get the benefits to that particular firm from all of the R&D that they pay for. There are these positive externalities with research and development that it's quite difficult for any individual firm to capture, which is why governments around the world do subsidise research and development. And you could argue that maybe this is what the government's trying to do with this particular element of the bill. But then why wouldn't you have an across-the-board consistent approach to supporting research and development through the tax system rather than this ad hoc approach if we were to be charitable, which is what the government's doing with the changes in this bill around unsuccessful software development? That seems to me a much more consistent approach. New Zealand spends about 1.31% of GDP on research and development, private and public, which puts us at the very low end of the OECD and well below the OECD average, which is over 2%. So the fact that the government is taking what charitably could be called an ad hoc approach to supporting R&D seems very strange. Why not take a much more consistent approach? Finally, Mr Speaker, one of the issues that's come up about how to deal with government deficits has been widely discussed now in the international media, and the most recent Economist addresses exactly this question. And what they say is that actually we need to make sure that the tax system addresses inequalities. The Economist magazine talks about taxing the rich. Another way to look at it is making sure that we address inequalities. And one of the things that they talk about is making sure that property is taxed properly. What we find in New Zealand, without a proper capital gains tax and without proper taxation of capital gains, particularly those in the property sector, is that we don't have proper taxation of the property sector. And so, completely against the advice of a magazine like The Economist, this government is continuing to go down a path where they don't tax property properly, they don't broaden the tax base through elements like a capital gains tax, like an irrigation levy. Mr Speaker, this bill demonstrates why the government has got its fiscal and taxation strategy wrong.
I call